Hello everybody! Today, I'm going to show you how I turned 2 thrifted men's shirts into a kimono style robe. That's today on Refashioning with Rachel. First, while wearing the shirt, I made a mark where I wanted the sleeve to end. And I also made a mark on the side seams at my waistline. I trimmed off the sleeves where I made the mark, and trimmed off the bottom of the shirt in a straight line. I cut off the button placket and the collar, and made a mark at the center front of the shirt at the waistline. I drew a straight line from the neck hole to this mark and cut along those lines. Moving on to the second shirt, I cut out a 7-inch wide strip from the bottom and removed the button placket. And pinned it to the bottom of my main shirt with right sides together. And stitched the pieces together. Throughout this project, I used a wide zigzag stitch to finish off the raw edges of the seams. One stitch goes off the fabric and the next stitch goes on the fabric, and it ends up creating a stitch that wraps up the loose ends nicely. I pressed the seam toward the bottom of the shirt and trimmed off the excess fabric. I cut out a few more 5-inch wide strips of fabric from the second shirt and stitched the ends together. Then I pressed open that seam and folded the whole seam in half and pressed it in place. Then I pinned the strip all along the opening of the robe, lining up all of the raw edges. I trimmed off the extra fabric and sewed the strip to the opening of the robe, making sure all 3 raw edges were lined up. Then I finished off the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. I made a hem on the bottom of the robe, simply by folding up the raw edge twice and securing with a straight stitch. I pressed the seam flat and pressed the hem of the robe. I cut out a couple more 5-inch wide strips from the second shirt. And folded it in half, lining up the fold with the fold in the sleeve. I made a mark at the width of the sleeve and trimmed off the extra fabric after adding a seam allowance, and stitched the ends together. I pressed open the seam, then folded the cuff in half and pressed it in place. I pinned the cuff to the end of the sleeve, lining up all raw edges, and pinning the seam of the cuff to the seam of the sleeve. And then I sewed the 2 pieces together. And finished off the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. And pressed that seam flat. With the remainder of the second shirt, I cut out as many 5-inch wide strips as I could until I had enough to make a strip about twice as long as my waist. I attached all these pieces together at the ends to make one long strip. And pressed the seams open. I folded down and pressed 1 centimeter all along the top of the strip. And did the same thing at the bottom. Then I folded the whole strip in half, lining up the folds, and pressed it in place. I unfolded each end of the strip and folded it back upon itself and made a stitch about 1 centimeter away from the end. I trimmed back the seam and folded it right sides out and tucked in the folds. Then I made a stitch close to the folded end of the strip . Pivoting at the corners . And then sewing all the way up the other side of the strip. I made a couple of thread knot belt loops at the side seams where I marked off my waist earlier. I might make another tutorial to show exactly how I did this in more detail. But basically, I fed some thread through the side seam, leaving one big loop and one long tail of thread. And then I pulled the tail of thread through the loop, creating a little knot, which I slid down to the bottom of the loop, and kept repeating this process until I had a long chain of knots. When I had about a 5-inch chain of knot, I put the thread through the loop and pulled it tightly, and then put the needle through the side seam and tied off a knot on the inside of the robe. And I did the same thing on the other side. Lastly, I decided to make some pockets out of some scrap fabric from the first shirt. So I cut out a couple of 6 by 7-inch rectangles . I pressed and hemmed the top of each rectangle . Then pressed the other 3 sides of each rectangle . I pinned them to the robe where I wanted them . and stitched them in place. And then, this project was finished. So here's a reminder of how this project looked before. And here's how it looks now. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you did. And check out some of my other refashioning videos. And have a beautiful day.